Hello and welcome. This is Corey Angelot. This is the end of Slavery Summit. I am here with Teace Snyder. Am I saying your name correctly? You got a cool name, my dude. You're a writer, director, producer, editor, actor, illustrator, podcaster, and host of Conspiracy Synergy. Conspiracy Synergy is a more lighthearted approach to the darkest themes of our time. Why? Because love conquers all, silly rabbit. So I really like the way you have laid out your website for anybody who's curious. Conspiracysynergy.com. So that's conspiracysynergy.com. You'll see you have like episodes. And like you said, you also have references per episode so people can do more research into what they're looking at. And I kind of also like your background with all the the books. So how about you do a little bit more of an introduction about what it is that you're doing with all your episodes and why you have your website laid out the way it is.
Sure. I'm an artist, and I've always felt that the purpose of art in our lives is to allow us to be able to make paradigm leaps or connections that we otherwise might not necessarily be logically inclined to do. And when it comes to inquiry into the realm of conspiracy and its various different manifestations, both in the materialist realm and extending significantly beyond that into the occult, we're not, from a left hemisphere perspective, oriented in a manner in which we would be receptive to that exploration. So the artistic medium and the processes by which you go about introducing other people to these beliefs is that which actively facilitates their ability to engage. And so the combination of my skill sets as an artist and understanding of the paradigm breaks of human language, and then trying to lend my skill sets to the exploration of controversy and conspiracy, is sort of the culmination of all of the different roads that I've taken in my life leading to where I am now. So that's kind of what I'm up to and what I'm trying to do.
Great. Yeah. And so you mentioned, you're an artist. That's one of the things I did not mention among the other list of things that you do here. And so let's kind of dive into that. You were mentioning to me before how art and creativity can kind of be really important for how human beings can free themselves. Why is that? And, what can we do with it?
Yeah, so a lot of how people think of artwork has to do with the way in which it's been packaged for them to then repackage and present again. So, in other words, we've had the industrialization of how we think of art overtake what would otherwise stem from our hearts. And so, what art actually is the culmination or the greatest degree to which we can express anything. And that means that anything can be art. If you do something very well, whatever, say that you make cabinets very well, that can be an art form. So it's very easy to understand that art is something that is inherent to people, that allows us to communicate things on the highest level, and that if it isn't molded or modeled into an industrialized like variant, then we're much more inclined to go about exploring it and then sharing those expressions with one another. So we all love movies. I'm not saying that they're a bad thing, but if you're only ever given the same point of reference for what an assembled product looks like or what its purpose is, say entertainment, versus, let's say, or engaging people enough where they're able to then embody what they've viewed and then take it into themselves so that they're able to then disseminate that, it's supposed to be more of like a shamanistic like transmutation and less of a mirror that we just look into striking the poses of over and over again. And so the industrialization of art has robbed the human expression of the depths of our hearts, and because of that we lack the language we need to really connect.
Hmm. Yeah, I can kind of understand where you're coming from. I think there's a lot of people out there who might have had like favorite video games of the past or movies of the past, and they try to look for like, oh, could I find a movie that was just as good as it was back then, or music or games? And I mean, I would say a lot of people in today's world feel like they made better things back then.
Yeah.
And that's, by they, I mean us. I mean, the human species as a whole. Why is it that art is sort of declining? Is it because of that industrialization?
Oh yeah, well, it isn't just the industrialization process of it, it's the iterative byproduct of existing in an industrialized environment, which is the gradual sort of like rape and pillage of creativity. It's more about having something done and appeasing demographics that will have like studio sales, but not necessarily be illustrative of anything of actual substance. And so it's the predictive programming matrix has been dialed up, not only from the explicit intentions of people who want to control our culture, but so too as a byproduct of us existing in paint by numbers. And because of that, lacking the sporadic desire to sort of mix and match and create of our own accord. So it's like we've been sort of stripped bare by the industry creating a cage-like environment. And at the same time, when you live in environments like that, you aren't necessarily inspired to make them all that much better. You just want to find almost like a set of bars that makes you feel more nostalgically warm and fuzzy about where you've been. And so it's like this almost hypercube entrapment that we continue to play into with the investment of our energy. And that's sort of what I meant with the idea of our liberty and our freedom being like intimately entwined with our creative approaches, because that's the language of nature, is creativity. And that's how you're able to, that old Jurassic Park saying of, you know, it's like life finds a way. The way that it finds a way is through creativity. And so that's kind of like how that whole process has come to clamp down upon us, and how then we ourselves have participated in that same process.
Hmm. Okay, so yeah, freedom and creativity going hand in hand. So like the way I see it is, if you don't have freedom, how can you even express your creativity to begin with?
Yeah, yeah,
So you're saying they're kind of interrelated as well, like in the expression. So if people are not like free to express themselves, and then you're gonna have sort of that industry takeover. I mean, how do
yeah.
you prevent that industry takeover? Is it by having more freedom within the aggregate of society generally?
I agree that that would, in essence, contribute to it, but it wouldn't necessarily wholly account for it. What you would want to have would be a holistic equilibrium of the balances between hemispheres, and then a holistic intelligence insofar as like the mind, heart, gut. Because
Okay.
ideally, like even if you're calibrating your intellect, your greatest level would be heart-based intelligence. So even using the representation of the calibrating of the sacred masculine and sacred feminist, looking at that from a left and right hemisphere kind of like equilibrium between the two, uh, you then want to step that up to even higher levels and make it holistic. So, but that's a point of introduction from like the materialist kind of perspective of the asymmetrical lean on the left hemisphere that makes us disproportionately binary and mechanical in our perception, which then makes us disproportionately the likeness of that in our own expressions, be they artistic, creative, whatever. They're still disproportionately locked within a paradigm of perception that is
Mhm.
not illustrative of our greatest ascension.
Yeah, I know there's some people who say the left versus right brain thing doesn't have enough, science or does not really validate. I don't know what your views are on that.
My views on that would be to grab this book, which is Master and His Emissary, which is Ian
Okay.
McGilchrist, and it goes into more of the framing of why the brain is divided as it is. And that's it's a lot more complicated than almost like the rudimentary framing of masculine and feminine and mechanical, versus receptive. So left hemisphere is a microscope, right hemisphere is a radio. There's a lot more complexities when you go into this. So I can understand the criticisms that people have in viewing it as reductionistic. That said, the more in which you dive into it, uh, generally speaking, you can get a good sense of it that way. Historically speaking, it provides a tremendous amount of insight into how a lot of the things that we've observed emerge, like Malthusian, like philosophy, and a variety of other, like Descartes, and all of these kind of like particular left brain leanings have sort of like built on top of each other. So it isn't just that that's the structure; it's what are the philosophies that almost like parasitically emerge from that structure in order to then restructure all of our external environment so that it feeds into itself. Because it's like that the hypercube in the esoteric, it's getting caught up in the same form over and over and over and over again, that's what creates the prison. So it's like being able to break out of the confinement of that geometry that in an iterative way feeds into itself is so paramount to us being able to escape the cage.
What do
So
you
it's like,
mean
yeah.
by that geometry? If you don't mind, just explain a little bit more about
Sure.
that?
So, like the hypercube being the illustration of a cube that constantly creates and sucks itself in over and over again. And that's an example of a geometry that is illustrative of a prison, an eternal prison. And it's an eternal prison because of our very way of conception. In order to be able to break out of it, just have the cube become a circle, have the circle become something else, and you're able to allow the geometry to speak to the evolution of who we are as people in our pursuit of being free. And ultimately, the greatest freedom that you can realize is creativity. It's like you're co creating, actively participating in what then is disseminated outward from within. That's the highest point that we can reach, is the creativity that nature speaks through us.
Okay. Yeah, so I see here we're making some like distinctions and we're saying, okay, here you got industrialization and here you got more so freedom with the creativity. And then you kind of gave us some philosophical background, which I found quite interesting because I talked with Roger Poole, somebody who also goes by the name Roge. And he kind of gave us a philosophical foundation as to understanding, well, what happened to purpose? What about meaning or value in
Mm.
philosophy? Has those things kind of been swept away when it came to bringing in the materialist philosophy?
Oh, yeah.
So does that have to do with creativity as well?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's what I mean. That's the that framework of understanding is the degree to which a particular consolidation or viewpoint of reality has disproportionately come to mar or malign the actuality. And so the more in which we're sort of browbeaten under that hypermasculinity in order to conform to the dredges of the contemporary, like what we've had to go through in this consolidation of human slavery, the more in which we participate in that, the more in which we become it, the more in which we facilitate it. So it's a never ending sort of iterative process of our assimilation until we pull away from it and create something new. And that's sort of like the dredges and the trenches of those philosophies are very difficult to come out of, the more in which we ourselves are sort of like enmeshed with them. And that's
Mm.
why it's so painful and so difficult and takes so long to do this. It's a separating of the external as well as it is the separation of the internal. And it's very difficult to do that on an individual level, and so too in the aggregate of society.
Yeah, we can kind of maybe relate that to the slave-like condition in the 1800s when the chattel slaves are on the plantation. They couldn't think of any reality other than the
Yeah.
current reality they were in. They were born into a slave family, and to think of freedom would be fearful. It's like, what is this new reality I've never lived before? I've never been free. What is freedom? What is even morality? I mean, I don't, how they didn't even know how to read or write. So I mean, what creativity could they express at all? Is it
Yeah.
because they were not free?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
And even then, depending on any attempt that they might make to be creative, would almost intuitively, from the desire of those who want to oppress, be removed from them. And at the exact same time, oppression elicits from within us a desire to create, either to cope with the situation that we can't escape or to find a way to liberate. So the example of that is why a caged bird sings. You know, it's coping with what it is to be imprisoned. At the same
mm,
time, it's speaking to life, a part of the beauty of its own nature, which is that it has this lovely voice. So the
it's
the
true.
circumstance of slavery, and you give it a good example of it, brings sort of this doom and gloom to the expression of life, and it's both a way of coping and a way of escaping.
Interesting. Yeah, so coping. So you can kind of see creativity then as like that tool. It's like, well, I want to be free, so how about I just start manifesting it within my thoughts and
Yeah.
try to put the intent out there right before I put the action out there, sort of just
Mhm.
to lay the groundwork. Some people are like, man, I want it to rain, or oh, I'm going to prepare for this day. Well, I'm going to have to set my mindset first, and then take the action. It's quite interesting. So, if people want to be free in their minds and they manifest freedom or they express it through creativity, I mean, what could that do for society alone, potentially? Um,
Literally everything. Yeah.
you think so?
Oh yeah, no, like so it's one of those things where Think of a conversation that you're having with another person. If you automatically apply the concept of infinite creativity, you'll have whatever idea you need to have to be able to broach what was previously an infinite divide between you. So the premise of human connection hinges upon our ability to step beyond the margins of our constraints. And yet at the same time, we're chastised or shamed or shunned should we attempt to do that. And the reason is because it has to be absolutely perfect or it's meaningless. And so that's one
Mm.
of those things where the more in which you come to understand how powerful art is, it becomes closer to the truth. It doesn't have to be identical to the truth because metaphor has an interaction with the truth such that I describe it as an iris. It's a calibration that orients an individual based on what they can be receptive to. Some people, you can show them the truth and it'll be just blinding. But other people, if you show them a calibrated metaphor for that truth with a closed down iris, less of the light is getting in and they're able to look at it and perceive it for what it is so that then they can come back to the truth and it'll have something that isn't just blinding for them anymore. It'll have insights. And so it's one of those really interesting things where the insight that we're lacking in one another is the refinement of our ability to be creative with each other. And then at the same time, think of the industrialization of our expectations. If something isn't created with a particular level of production values, we automatically shit on it. Imagine like how beautiful the idea of another human being writing you a poem or giving you a picture or something like that. How important that is insofar as your relationship is. But automatically you're already shitting on it because it doesn't have the budget that Star Wars did.
Yeah.
So not only have we had our language destroyed, we've had our ability to listen to one another's expressions destroyed because we have the expectation that it's supposed to look like the industrialized variant that we go out there and laugh about in movie theaters designed to entrain us.
So how did we get to that point? How did we get to that point of enslavement? Was it through false forms of creativity,
Yeah,
deceiving
yeah.
forms?
So it's synthetic mockeries that we conflate as if the same or substitute as if more important. And a good example of this in nature again is so there. I don't remember exactly where this is. I think it's in Mexico. It could be in Arizona. But there's a particular kind of orange soda bottle that is just a large orange bottle that keeps getting discarded on the side of the road. And there's in that region a large orange beetle that finds this soda bottle so sexually attractive because it's a giant bootied orange thing that it thinks is a beetle that the beetle population is starting to decline because it's so wrapped up in fucking the orange bottle and it's no longer interested in finding its own species. A lot of what has been done to our perception is the supplementing of the synthetic, which is augmented to appear as if better. And then we're constantly almost like chasing the heroin that we injected just to be able to stay stable. It's sort of like
Interesting.
that. It's the
Yeah.
addictive processes that then supplement our ability to recognize what is ultimately best for us.
Would you say our natural reality has been covered by illusions of unnatural realities that we think are natural?
Oh yeah, yeah. There are all kinds of layers to that. The simple and easiest one is just to look at advertising and propaganda and the whole Edward Bernays like scaffolding of creating a world where not only are they not going to show you a realistic picture of a hamburger, they're not going to show you what happens to the cow prior to the point of making the burger. So there are all these different layers of deception and acclamation that are stacked on top of each other in order to create that collective deception.
Okay. Yeah. And that makes sense, right? If we look at systems of government that have grown super tyrannical, we would say, "Oh, well, it's corrupt here, it's corrupt there. There's so many reasons why it's tyrannical, why we're calling it tyrannical, why everybody's affected because it's affecting people at every level, right?" So, would you say government is sort of by within itself a sort of a manifestation of the industrialization or the material? I mean, it's not natural, right? Does that have to do with it?
It's an interesting idea. It's fear-based stagnation that comes into being out of a desire to control the whole of the population and what can potentially come about from the um, let's say unencumbered wellspring of human beings. If you don't control what comes out of them, then you don't have your say at the end of the day. And that's literally all government is. It's the parasitic mindset that the decree of a select few is the determinant of what comes to be of the many, and that they will use that leveraged control structure to determine everything on this earth and will lie to everyone that it has to be that way, because without it, it would just be chaos. When really the reality is that without it, it would be a bountiful garden, much more prosperous. And it is the parasitic predatory mindset that has been put upon us that has kept us from our own liberation. So it's a lot of different layers
Ourselves.
to the distortion. Yeah, yeah. I use it to describe it as our cells have themselves been turned into our cells. So it's turning our bodies into our prisons, using that same sort of like insight of the language to go about doing that. So that it's like Frederick Douglass, or yeah, the whole, slaves who don't understand their slaves, they're the most enslaved. That entire thing.
Yeah, I call it mental slavery in
Yeah,
my book. It's the most dangerous form of
yeah,
slavery.
yeah,
Gandhi said it. Bob Marley said it. Martin Luther King Jr. said it. All these people were talking about what mental slavery is,
yeah,
and I sort of correlate that to physical slavery, how
yeah.
one always leads to the other, and it's quite interesting that we're kind of tying in these ideas. So going along those lines of slavery, freedom, and the aggregate of society. So you're saying it's us. We are partly responsible, right, for the world condition. So how did we more so contribute to that condition of tyranny? If we were to look at any tyrannical empire in history, um, why is it because we suppressed our creativity? Is it because we did not express ourselves, or that we did get caught up in illusions, and we weren't conscious enough to recognize they were illusions?
It's a lot of different things overlapping with one another in different sort of breaths and emergences, because it isn't singularly, let's say, an upward trajectory or a downward spiral. It's both in a pendulum swing, back and forth. So looking at like the past few thousand years, which has been the continued sort of downward spiral of our consolidation into matter, and the adverse karmic consequences that come about in that sort of pendulum swing, which can also be described as the breath of Brahman. It's like those inward and outward breaths of the universe that bring with them either the ascension or descension of our consciousness as men. So very, very broad lens, that's what's been going on. To a certain extent, it's not that you can't escape it. It's that as the external environment of consciousness at any given period of time changes, we're going to go through those changes as well. So to a certain extent, within the period of time that we went through, it's kind of an inevitability, or I'll just say that it's so much more likely, and so much the probability goes up so much that it borders on prophecy. And so that's sort of what we're
Mm,
coming out of. There have been a lot of different steps forward and step backs within that kind of time frame, and even then it goes a few thousand years prior to that. So that's like a 2 to 4 thousand year chunk where we've been going through this dissension and now culminating in the ascension process again. um, we have very much been co-creating in the process of that, but I constantly use the metaphors for what's been happening to and being done with the species at large as a cooking process. And a good example of this is what happens with cheese. If you look at it from a microbial perspective, or like the microbes and vying for resources in a finite region, it's literally just like waves of genocide and devastation as these organisms try and figure out what there is to eat and able to grow and refine themselves over time. So if you think of the universe as cooking with the resonant energy of the species over very long periods of time, it's the equivalent kind of making cheese. We're going to go through these bouts of genocidal kind of just like back
mm,
and forths where we don't have the ability to open up from the seed that we're in, or from the wax that we've been encased by. And only in time, once we reach a particular flavor, do we find ourselves on a plate being mixed with a different ingredient. So it's sort of like the cooking processes of existence itself over thousands of years, and how our attempts to be creative within that can facilitate short-term creativity. Look at, for example, using the metaphor of culinary continuing, how our fusions of foods have interacted alongside of warfare. So that gives you an example of how something
yeah.
where we're murdering each other also allows for creativity. So creativity comes out of both ends of the spectrum. And as we move out of the creativity that has been how to more imprison and encage us, we'll move into the creativity of how can we escape the cage. Because there's the whole inversion principle thing too. There's creativity in the sense of how to calculatively apply depravity. And we've had an extraordinary stretch of that kind of creativity just going all over the place. And so it's like, what kind of creativity are we talking about here? Good or evil? And that's sort of like what comes out of those inward and outward breaths of our exploration and experience of what it is to be people.
Wow, yeah, I think cooking is definitely somewhere you can learn a lot from, especially if you have a creative mind. I mean, just
Yeah.
food in general or health, and looking at the health of all things and how things interact with one another. So, like you said, like if you were to combine certain foods, maybe they don't taste so well, or maybe the nutrients and they don't work so well together, but other foods might work really well together. And then it's like a matter of understanding the time and place, as I would call it, as to where things are supposed to be in our lives. And I think that takes time, right? It's like understanding, well, who am I? What am I doing on this earth? Like, what am I trying to achieve? That can sometimes take time to understand. Maybe some patience too, especially with cooking. And if you're fermenting something, it's got to be in a set temperature, set environment. And so there's a lot of connections you can make with food. I definitely agree. There's a word that I use too is denaturing. The world is denaturing if we are not in alignment to ourselves or our purpose, may you say, going back to like Aristotle's teleology. And these are the type of ideas talk about a lot. But in cooking, they say when you cook something, you're denaturing a protein. So it's quite interesting because you're taking it away from its original form. So, kind of something that was coming to mind when you were talking about that was this idea of evolution versus like involution, for
Mm.
example. Are we moving forward in history or are we kind of moving backwards? And a lot of people feel like, oh, well, maybe things just have to start over. Oh, like our creativity's dead. Like we're never going to be able to create good music again. Like, I don't know if that's a really good mindset for creativity.
No. Yeah, no, the idea of where we're at versus where we're going, I think it is one of those things where it's a timeline divergence. And so it really is where you invest yourself and where you genuinely come to be insofar as your inner work. And it is the process of the refinement of the internal actively made external within your daily actions that will culminate in you taking the right direction. Because a saying that I use is that destiny isn't written, it's in the writing. So given that, if you want a different destiny, start writing it. Stop expecting it to be something that will be written for you and start actively participating in the writing it, and then the future will come to be that version that you turn down the road of. It isn't just one road. They're the two primary timelines you can look at in any given moment, and you use the words involution or evolution to describe them, and that's accurate. There are a lot of different timelines in that every different word that we use and every different thing that we do brings about kind of just micro changes in the short term, but in the broad, foundational, fundamental, underlying arteries of the directions that we can choose to go in, it's your higher self or your lower self, it's involution or evolution.
Hmm. So start creating essentially, and stop asking for permission, for
Yep.
that creation to be
Yep.
done. And it's quite interesting because, some people want to have a connection with a creator, right? A worldly creator, which is outside of us, something that created us. But we ourselves are also creators, right?
Yep.
Perhaps a reflective
Yep.
um, way of creative ability. So maybe, we're kind of just tapping into that source and recognizing who we are. Like I said, finding our
Accurate.
purpose.
Yep.
Um, so going along the lines of evolution, another thing I think about is, well, why did we end slavery in the 1800s? One form of slavery. That was an evolutionary achievement, was it not?
I see it as an economic uh, byproduct of the illegitimacy and ineffective nature of the practice in that time period. If you look at what's happening with the digital integration of systems around people and into people, it's a more economic model of the exact same like immoral uh, conceptual framework by which we go about harnessing or imprisoning people. So, because of the digital environments that are ubiquitous, simply by our engagements with them, you can use that as a template for human slavery that is 20% more effective than it was before, which is enough to make the difference in what had previously resulted in slavery going out of business. It went out of business because it was a stupid, shoddy, crappy business that couldn't stand up to the workmanship or wherewithal of people who weren't in those situations. Now they're trying to take another crack at that because in this environment they might be able to make it a little bit more prosperous, and depending on how you apply your conscious energy and the direction that you take through time, you'll either come to see that like around you in a very threatening and pervasive way, or you'll gradually be able to diminish the degree to which all of the species feels any need to indulge in that paradigm whatsoever.
Wouldn't you say it's kind of creative on part of the people who are in control of things to find ways of controlling other
Oh
people?
yeah, that's what I mean. Like the
Yeah.
inversion principle creativity, they're going to find more sick and messed up ways to torture than you ever imagined before, and for them, that's going to be. So think about it this way: like I use the example of describing a Thanksgiving from the perspective of a turkey, which all of us, we understand Thanksgiving. You get together, you eat food, you're happy, you celebrate things. But describe it to the turkey. It's like, okay, not only are we going to kill you, but then we're going to rip out all of your feathers. We're going to cut you open. We're going to pull stuff out of your butt. We're then going to go take a bunch of stuff that we randomly got together in a field, shove it up your butt. And then we're going to shove you in a very hot environment and periodically paint you with the curdled drippings of a cow's tit. And the turkey's just going to be like, okay, well, what are you even talking about, dude? Are you insane? It's like, what is wrong with you people that you would do that? But once again, think of how far a predator will go to cook with its prey in exactly the way that it wants to enjoy that flavor. So that kind of creativity, is it coming from the predator or is it coming from the prey? And so we're coming out of that long stretch of predatorial creativity, and that's something that's going to continue to be there in the force of involution because it never goes away. So even as we learn about all of these beneficial things, that entire realm, oh, it's still going to be there. It's not going anywhere. And we need to be honest about the reality of that whole spectrum of insight into the creative process. It's good and it's bad. It's everywhere all at once.
So would you say an alternative to that predatory creativity is a different form of creativity? I don't know if you have a term for it. That's like a right brain.
Yeah,
Uh,
so ultimately it would be I just use a convergence of terms, which is when you get into the distinction between magic and sorcery. Because when
okay.
you really describe what creativity is on its highest level, it is either magic or sorcery. And so that's the distinction being, are you operating in accordance with higher will, or are you using these kind of tricks and creative things in order to benefit your will? So is it higher self, lower self? And it's just kind of that juggling and balancing act. And it's always a constant process of waking up and refining, because you're never really all the way there. Anytime that you're a creative mind, you're always trying to improve that or learn other things or mix things. And so it's exponential. Yeah.
Mhm. Now, for people who don't really understand the difference, like between magic and sorcery, the
Yeah.
way I see magi, doesn't that word mean to create?
I don't know the etymology of like it's
Yeah, I'm
very
pretty
different
sure
words.
because if you look at imagination, it's like image and imagery. It's basically a form of creation. The word magi, so it's like magician, and there's a
Yeah.
tarot card for it as well. Mark Passo even makes a distinction between sorcery as controlling other people to do your will, and
Yeah.
magic doing the good for the will. The will
Yeah.
of all of creation, the higher lowercase. I mean, the uppercase W. Um, and so there's a lot of connections you can make, I guess, with occultism. I mean, that's kind of creative too, is it not? You start studying that stuff, it's like, whoa, what am I getting into? And by occult, just to clarify for people out there, it just means hidden. And we usually refer to like hidden knowledge or mystery traditions, ancient schools of thought. Um, I'm not sure how much you've kind of looked into that and see creativity there, but I see there's all sorts of amazing things that's like, how would people come up with this or that? Well, is it just observations of nature? Because to me, that's how I kind of get my creativity. I look around
Mhm.
the world and I make connections.
Yeah.
What would you say are some helpful ways people can get creative themselves, to sort of free their minds a bit more and express themselves?
It's a highly individual thing. So, as much as I can give advice, it's not something that ultimately my advice will be the determinant of how the reality comes to unfold. I use the descriptor of every man is a sculpture and every man is a sculptor. So, it alludes to the note that you had made before, that we ourselves are creations of the creator, which are in turn going about creating. And the highest degree to which we can see that come into being is to be in line with the creator. So, it's one of those things, when you're in alignment, it ups your game. And if you're using the inversion principle, then you need to be really in line with like our lower selves in order to up that game. So no matter who you are and what your creativity is, it's about finding the connection between you and your creator. It's being the sculpture and the sculptor. It's both of those things. My personal experience of it, I don't know if this is ubiquitously the case, but it's very, very painful. It almost seems to come with it to a certain extent. And I'll point to the etymology of the word of passion for that, which is that it's derived from suffering. So if you think of things that you're very passionate about, it's going to overlap with suffering. You can look at a contemporary artist who kind of dabbled hints of this just prior to his death, which is Philip Seymour Hoffman. He was giving an interview at one point, and he later died of a heroin overdose, which is basically suicide. But what he was talking about is that the pursuit of greatness is torturous. And that's been my experience, is that you can go out there and be creative and have fun with it, and everything is like, well, what are you trying to accomplish with it? How good do you have to be? Like, who are you up against? Not just yourself. It's like, what else is being created around you? Do you stand a chance against that? And then in the process of going through all these different refinements, both internal and external, it will become torturous. And then it is the transmutation of that torturous feeling within all of us that allows us to, and this is a metaphor that I use, knit razor wire into a cashmere sweater. So it's very painful for you, but you're able to give that which would have been painful for someone else to them in a way that is very beautiful and luxurious, and not a single solitary strand of that cashmere sweater can be anything other than perfect, or that's the only thing they'll be able to feel. So it is the alchemical, shamanistic transmutation of an emotional state of being put into an internal cauldron in order to bring about something that you can feed to someone else and have them say, yum. What that is for you, I can't tell you, but nature can. So listen.
Okay. Yeah. I kind of, get creativity myself when I journal, when I kind of like reflect and listen, like you said, and sort of just like observe and take the time to really think things through and let the ideas sort of flow to me.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if like what you're talking about kind of relates to the idea of alchemy, but that's kind of what I was trying to kind of
They're the same
feeling.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. With
When
the
you understand the metaphor of
transmutation.
alchemy, yeah, when you understand the metaphor of alchemy, it alludes to the alchemist. And so, in one sense, you can take that as completely literal, and it's true. In the other sense, the alchemy is the refinement of the ingredients that you're using entwined with the internal person. So, yes, that's very much a part of what's going on. And that mindset is very much applicable to that discipline.
Yeah. And you were mentioning like sort of the creation and the creator. Well, it's interesting, because you would think that people would want to create something that reflects themselves or something that reflects their current ideas or maybe even higher ideas that are beyond them. But there's a lot of things that might be in contradiction to ourselves. Like, are we creating something that we can't escape out of because we create so much of it? We conditioned ourselves to our own creations or to putting out a certain message. Like if I went online and I said a certain thing so many times and made it my brand, and like everything I did was about this one thing, well, it's going to be probably harder for me to like escape that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of in the world we live in too, is that sort of conditioning to the previous art, the previous creativity we're already delved into.
Yeah,
We
that
kind of
sentiment.
feel.
That is what I mean by industrialization of art, the
Mhm.
industrialization of art. The exact same thing that you're describing. That's what I mean. Is it
Yeah.
becomes that whole recreative process of just boring ourselves into particular positions and things that we then feel compelled, almost like we're bound by them, you know?
Hmm.
But it's so the exact point that you're making, that's exactly what I'm referring to. That process happening.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. So we're kind of talking a lot about adding something into creation, sort of, even though we're kind of improvisers, are we not? We're not really creating anything because everything's already here. We're just taking different parts and pieces and like you said, kind of like transmutating. We're just bringing things together and turning them into different formats. Would you say that's correct? Like we're not really adding anything new into creation. We could say that we are, but technically we're just taking what already exists because there's nothing new under the sun. That's the common phrase.
Yeah, I a lot of that has to do with our perceptual framework of time. Insofar as the Akashic records, yes, what you're saying is true because it's always been there. So it's just there, and we're in essence just experiencing it for ourselves. So it's more to do with the experience of the creation than it is about the creation. That said, in a linear progression of time, it is creation, and we are a part of that. And that's why we were created, is because from the 11 dimensional perspective of what we're able to do with our minds, it's the most sophisticated thing that we've observed in nature. So that's one of those things where that's what allows us to so powerfully entwine ourselves with our higher selves, which is all of time, in order to offer to the future that which has yet to be realized, except once again from the perspective of the Akashic record, yeah, it's all already been created. So it's kind of like it's time's the answer to the question.
Yeah, and for people who don't know what the Akashic record is, what is that about? Is that something people should look into?
Yeah, so the easiest way to understand that would be if you stop looking at time as a linear progression, but instead you look at all different things that could have happened or all different things that have happened. Akashic record is more all that has transpired or will transpire. And so it's
Okay.
more just like a point of reference for what viewing experiential reality is when it's not constrained by a linear perspective. And even
Interesting.
then, that might not be the best description of the Akashic record. So I'd have to go and look up like how that's like defined from their perspective. Basically right hand path, left hand path kind of stuff, mystery school thing.
Okay. Yeah, that's obviously crazy, a big topic. So kind of the reason why I also asked like about adding things in is what about taking things out?
Oh yeah.
So, we can be creators and we can create things, but when we realize certain things may not be so productive or beneficial for us, may we want to take things out? Because, in the 1800s, the movement to end slavery was called abolitionism. I
Mhm.
refer to myself as an abolitionist. It simply just refers to the idea or the act of abolishing. So isn't that interesting? It's like kind of relating this back to health. It's like, well, if you want to help your body and heal your lifestyle, maybe you should get rid of this food because this food is causing all this inflammation. And maybe you want to add in this food instead, or maybe you want to add in to crowd out. What do you think about taking out of creation?
Oh yeah, exactly right. Because a lot of what we've had inserted or injected is under ostensible pretenses in order to subvert or commandeer without our conscious awareness what the output of our labor or energy is. And so the removing of the parasitic mindset is that which allows the beauty of nature to blossom and to be able to move in a direction that is conducive to the betterment of men.
Mm.
And a lot of that right now is removing things as much as it is creating things. So yeah, it's a very good insight.
Yeah, I think you can maybe make some connections between like the man-made and the natural. Like sort of what you're saying is, we've bombarded ourselves. When I think of industrialization, I think of cars and cities and all this massive skyscrapers, and it's like soon enough, it's like where are the trees? Where's the nature? It's like are we detached from our roots, where we came from, and is that the reason partly why we are in the condition that we are in, or why people in the city have more allergies than people in the country, or they're not being exposed to what maybe they should be exposed to. Would you say there's a connection between the natural and the unnatural here?
I see all of the various different physical manifestations of things as being illustrative of a philosophical construct that precedes them. And then the particular emergence and entwinement of those things have to do with what we have thus far experienced, been able to reflect on, or to be able to move beyond uh, how those things can also be barriers to us. So it's all natural. The question is how much of a perversion can you take it to? Because nature will only let you go to such an extent in any one direction before it doesn't really sustain itself or exist anymore. You can continue to entertain it with your imagination, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to return to it as something in reality that is just like I'll use the word good thing, even though it's not necessarily the best word. But if something cannot sustain itself in reality, is it a good thing? Or is it something that we have a tendency to wrap ourselves up in and invest our
Mm.
energy in a way that we lose more than we gain from? So it's like
Counterproductive.
that thing. Yeah. So if that can be the word utopia, the whole it's something the perfect way of being that's also not there versus the simulacrum notion, which is a fake story that we tell ourselves that isn't based on a reality, and then we're constantly trying to conjure the sentiments associated with that story as if to ground it in reality. So it's one of those things where we need to come back to what's true in order to be able to balance how far our imaginations might take us into imbalance because we want to control how we feel, and that can become very toxic and self-fulfilling,
So
perpetual.
before you mentioned how essentially you kind of get rid of the government or these systems or these illusions and you create more freedom. That's a
Mhm.
beautiful world. And some people might think, oh, well, that's utopia's thinking. That's extreme. That's the imbalance is, thinking that we can live without those systems. But is it really an imbalance if that is also our natural condition? I'm curious what you think about people who make those comments.
A lot of balance is defined by what people have been acclimated to, not what actual balance is. So we have been acclimated to a profound imbalance, and we look at that as if it's normal. It's like if you're eating tacos all the time and your head's constantly to the side because you're eating tacos, and someone's like, no, 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 this is balanced over here, and you look at them like they're crazy. It's like that's kind of what's been done to us as a species. We've got some serious problems with how we view things.
Hmm. Yeah. So now let's kind of delve a little deeper into action. Would you say there's certain things that you think people should do or independent media should do, people who are currently creating that they aren't doing that you would like to be seen doing?
So much, yes, but I think that's one of those things where it never really works that way. It's our responsibility to lead by example. So, as much as I wish other people were doing, I take it as a reminder that I need to get off my ass. And as people perceive or observe leaders in each of their respective capacities, then they fall in line of their own accord. If, however, you spend your energy trying to get them to fall in line, it's like a drill sergeant, and you accomplish nothing other than a militaristic, uh, like mimicry that passes from one generation to the next. You don't want to do that. We're not trying to create soldiers, and we're not trying to indoctrinate or industrialize people. We're doing our utmost to lead by example so that other people in perceiving that will be able to strengthen and embolden themselves and then lead by example in their own way. So it's a constant forward momentum in that way. So the premise of what can and should other people be doing, so many things, but it's like I drive myself crazy if that's one of the things where I keep returning to. It's like this person needs to do that, this person doesn't
Mm,
understand that, blah 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 blah, because
yeah.
then it's just like the poisonous almost contempt like marinades you in animosity until you aren't able to see your own purpose, because so many of the things that are lacking that you have the ability to recognize, that's your purpose. Holy shit, you have the ability to recognize that something's wrong, that something's broken. You know what that means? That the world was given you so you can help fix it. So that's an important thing.
Yeah, that's a huge point. But don't you also think maybe others helping you recognize could make a difference, or is it just expectations that are, like you said, they
Yeah,
kind of have to be filled by the individual that sees
so
it?
that's almost like the role of community. When you enter into that part of the conversation, it's moving beyond the recognition of the individuals and more reaching a point of community. And when it comes to that, that is one of those things where we do want people to be more reliable. We do want people to be more conscientious. We want people to be more uh, all of the things that we see as virtuous. We want more of that. And we want that from our communities. So that is one of those things where as you go from one level of analysis and then it changes to a different level of like from an individual family to an individual community to a city to what we call a state, all these different things. As you go from each of those points of analysis, it's always a microcosm, macrocosm entwinement and engagement between them. But different terms that may apply in one place are no longer applicable, or different terms that are absent from one place we feel as if they should be, because we want to move out of the individual responsibility of family units and of communities and observing leaders to societies where we know that that shit is there. And so that's one of those things where as we transition from those individual responsibilities to those larger conglomerates, the definitions change, and we need to know that that stuff is there, you know.
Would you say a movement would be helpful or necessary for the change that we desire? I know it's
I
a
would
bit of a question.
I would say that understandings are. Movements are almost the hijacking of understandings so that they are understandings that are almost like Trojan horses under brandings. So that's why it's so easy to co-opt and subvert movements, is because it's everyone's wearing the same color of t-shirt. It's like, okay, put
Mm,
one agent provocateur in there, movement over. Or it's everyone's wearing the same kind of like, yay, hippie love kind of thing. It's like, all right, get them all addicted to LSD and have them so that they're more interested in getting high than they are in reaching the species' greatest heights. So it's like
Mhm.
the understanding is what we actually need. Integrating that understanding into ourselves and disseminating it outwardly through our thoughts, feelings, and actions, our words, all of this. That, if it's just a movement, will be much easier to destroy, to subvert, or to misrepresent, so that other movements will move in opposition to that movement. So it's about like us seeing first principles as what's most important, not necessarily the truth movement itself. It's like we want to get people up to that level of genuine understanding.
Yeah,
That's
so
that's
like
how
the
I think.
ideas are
That's
on the
what I think the
spotlight.
best.
So like
Yeah,
the
yeah. Basically,
ideas,
like,
yeah.
do you genuinely understand this? Not, do you have the ability to wave a flag saying that you understand it?
Right.
No, nothing other than that. If you understand it, cool beans. If not, you're not doing the thing you're supposed to do. That's the problem, and it's
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. And maybe, some flags or whatever could help
Yeah,
other people find that information,
yeah,
but I agree, like, it's like, why do
yeah.
something or represent something it's like you don't know much about? Like, you should probably be pretty sure what actions you're taking in this life. It's like, "Oh, am I paying taxes? Am I doing this? Well, am I realizing what it's actually doing in the world around me? Is it contributing to violence? Is it contributing to slavery?" So let's kind of delve into your story. Sort of, this is like a final question, if you don't mind. I ask a lot
Sure.
of people this question, um, and I like to find out, how did you get to where you are? What your journey? How long were you a statist? And by statist, I mean an individual who believes in the legitimacy of authority or government. Um, and how did you escape out of that? And if you have a different perspective on it, of course, you may share.
So I was born a writer. I've known what I was going to do from not like basically before I could read or write, I would slather my hand on a keyboard and I would print it out and then I'd show it to my parents in order to have them point out words that I'd spelled by mistake. And so I intuitively understood from the very onset that words in the written language and my ability to communicate was paramount to my ability to accomplish anything on this earth or be heard and valued and respected as an individual. And we have this tendency to placate, marginalize, or disrespect children in subtle ways. Not that that's how we think of them, but we treat them more like children than we do really appreciate them as people. And so my desire or yearning for the acquisition of language was because I feel as if I have incarnated from probably being a kind of curmudgeonly old man. And so I'm like, all right, I've got all this stuff I'm trying to get these people to understand. And damn it, I got to learn all these words and art and stuff in order to be able to communicate it to them. So my felt intuitive sense was always that this is like a slave system, not using that word, but basically just that it's really broken and it's there to hurt people. And I always hated the compulsory school system. I was like the class clown, and it was something that was always very difficult for me. And so I went through the motions of trying to use creativity and humor as a coping mechanism in those environments, and also as a way to try and create my future. It's like, what is the thing that I'm going to do in the future that I already have this intuitive sense about? And so my emergence into the realm of what freedom is came as a consequence of the transition from Bush to Obama. And for people who don't understand what that time period looked like, it's like in the 9/11 truth movement, which I am a part of and have been for a long time, which is just trying to bring attention to the events of 9/11, looking at them with a critical lens. Uh, we were all very much of the impression that Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and all of his various different associations, the neocon infrastructure, was chiefly responsible for the events of 9/11. The more in which you look into it, the more in which you understand that it's actually much more likely a 40-plus year plot in order to bring about a transition in geopolitics. And it's less to do with a particular orientation of political party and more to do with the machinations of the machine itself. So my transition from what could be regarded as statist, although I don't feel intuitively as if I ever really identified within the machine or accepted it for what it is, but rather had vestiges of hope, which is a part of the establishment. It baits you with heroes and with hope and all this kind of stuff in order to lure you to reinvest in it. But I had voted for Obama because as a 9/11 truther, you look at it and you're like, maybe this actually is the potential emergence of something that is hopeful and freedom oriented from within the establishment. And then after a few years of observing the nightmare shit show warlord that psychopath was, you eventually realize, oh, it's all just a game. that's all it is. And then you're able to go deeper into your realizations about how reality is constructed in these various different iterations and layers, almost like an onion, designed to keep you going around in circles inside of this constrained philosophical mantra, which is that a parasitic and predatory environment is necessary in order to stay the tides of anarchy. When everyone who understands the actual etymology of anarchy understands that what they're really doing is they're stopping freedom from happening. And they're telling you that they need to do that in order to sustain chaos. And it's all this sorted, mixed up, backwards kind of thing. And those who have studied it understand that it's like that for a reason. But those of us who are learning about it, it's like you almost have to question your own reasoning so many times that you feel like you're going crazy until you can escape the machine. And so that was my whole trajectory, from incarnating with a particular perspective on my felt sense of purpose to then going through the ropes of realizing how mixed up it all is, to eventually emerging in the contemporary in the form of trying to take all that I've learned and then to offer it to other people, with the hopes that they themselves don't have to spend as much of their lives or their energy investing in the same basic processes that so many of us in the truth movement have had to go through or be backhanded by in order to come back and present you with something that doesn't hurt so much. Because that's what it is. You know, we're all here sort of sacrificing in our own ways to hopefully make it a little bit easier for the next generation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of been my whole experience of the thing.
Yeah, well, very well said. I appreciate you sharing everything about your experience. How much, how long would you say you were a statist? Like, if you can put amount of years on it.
I wouldn't even use that as a description because I always resented it. It's more how long do you go existing in what you identify as a
Yeah,
problem before you're able to articulate what the problem is. And so for me, that was a long time. I always knew that it was wrong. I always disagreed with it. I always fought back against it and hated it. But I didn't necessarily come to the particulars of articulating it in order to help other people liberate themselves from it.
yeah,
So I'd say that probably like early 20s or something you start to see the shift, but again that's less to do with what your actual beliefs are and more to
yeah.
do with if you've ever asked the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I particularly asked that question because it's kind of like, those compilations you'll see online of like, oh, X vegan, X this, like sort of it would be interesting to have a compilation or to show people like how many people have actually awakened out of the same sort of mentality. So I look at it sort of like just focusing on the ideas, and this is an idea that a lot of people don't know about. They don't
Yeah.
know about what this thing is, statism and slavery, and let alone all the occult things that we talked about today. But there is something that they can know, right? Which is perhaps themselves. They can start being creative, even if they feel like they don't have enough knowledge, right? If they feel like, oh, I don't have enough knowledge, I can't go about creating anything. Oh, I'm not a creative person. I don't think that's the best mentality to have if you want to be creative. I think you gotta you gotta find it within yourself, right? Everybody's got their own forms of creativity, would you
Yeah.
say?
No, I agree with that. I guess so. From that point of insight, I remember when I was first, because I started writing my first book when I was 10. And prior to that, I tried to write a few different like screenplays and short stories and stuff. And I remember when I was sitting down to do it the first time, I'm like, this is really hard. How could anyone ever write more than one book? It's like it's so difficult to do that. And so it's like now it's like I'm working on my 11th. I have 5 books that are terrible, so it's not like I have a perfect batting average or anything. But it's like the idea is that you start looking at something like it's impossible, and only in reaching for it do you ever reach it. So if it feels impossible, it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. Just stop feeling that it's impossible, try it over and over again, and the creative process of your exploration and reaching for it is what will allow you to reach it, even though it may come to you in a way in which you never conceived of it. Because the
Yeah.
creative process is creative with you. You think you already know it all when you go out on that pursuit. You come back a totally different person because you learn the reality. And that's the difference between sort of how we've been enchanted to perceive and what it is to believe in yourself.
Yeah, as a writer, I can definitely affirm what you just said. Once you kind of
Yeah.
sit down with yourself and you start creating, and a whole bunch of other ideas will come your way, and because you're setting that foundation, and from that foundation, everything could grow. I started with like a simple PowerPoint. What I thought was going to be a PowerPoint presentation turned into, a whole book, because I found out it's like, wait, there's a lot of details and a lot of things I could add on to this. And I just started writing. Made it the environment nice and suitable to the information, and the ideas flowed even better. Thank you for joining me and sharing everything. I appreciate your perspectives. You're very in detail. I like the way you always word things, and I encourage you to keep up what you're doing. Thank you very much for joining me. And everybody who wants to hear a lot more talks like this, go to nita.one/summit. That's nita.one/summit. This is Corey Engelot. Check out Teace Snyder. Your website is conspiracysynergy.com, right? Are you also on other platforms as well?
Yeah, so that's the site for the conspiracy show that I host, which is to get people up to speed about this, and it's also an outreach tool for their friends and family. But my personal website for my own art is teace.ca, so it's teace.ca, and yeah, those are the best ways to find me.
Awesome. Yeah, and everybody can check out his links and the downloadable resource that we'll provide as well. This is the end of Slavery Summit. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.